The date was June 15th, 2014. My team and I had decided to finally investigate the old asylum that stood alone and abandoned in Williamsburg, Virginia. This particular abandoned asylum had been the talk of the town for many years prior, with multiple stories and myths, the most famous being about students who snuck in and were found days later completely silent and void of themselves. According to the locals, the government followed up by launching an investigation, sending officials to uncover what had happened, but their findings were so grave they decided to sweep the case under the rug, hiding all students, parents, and officials who entered the asylum. The case was eventually buried, and the asylum was completely sealed off as toxic and harmful. The history of the asylum, while it was functioning, was still unknown, and the details of the students who explored it after it was abandoned are also unknown. My name is Jacob Benedict, and these are the details of how my team and I uncovered the terrifying secrets of the Williamsburg Abandoned Asylum. My team consisted of 5 individuals, including me, and at the time, we'd only been paranormal investigators for about 3 years. In these 3 years of working cases and seeing all sorts of things, we had come to the conclusion that despite whatever stories were told, they were just stories, and there really was no such thing as ghosts, creatures, or things that go bump at night. In this particular case, we heard first about it in March 2014, and finally decided to make the trip to the asylum in June. We got to the town late that day, and didn't do much except lodge in our hotel and brief on the case. We were immediately struck by the inconsistencies and the lack of information about the asylum, which set this case apart from anything we had encountered in the past. It piqued our curiosity and fueled our determination to uncover its secrets. The next day, we headed into town and split up into 2 groups, with 3 of my colleagues heading to the library to try to find out more about the history of the asylum, while Jessica, another one of my colleagues, and I went around town asking locals for any information they had. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?" I said as we approached a middle-aged lady in the street. She replied with,
"Yes, sure, but I'm in a hurry and I don't have much time."
"Yeah, no problem. It'll be quick. Can you provide us with any information on your town's old asylum?" I said. The expression on her face changed slightly before responding with,
"Well, I can't tell you much. If it has to do with that asylum, I know just as much as you."
Her response shocked me as I'd assumed a local would have a lot more information than we did. So I said, "Oh, I apologize. I had assumed since you lived here you'd know a lot more than I do."
"Well, I can see how you'd think that, but I'm sorry, I don't know much, and I don't think anyone you speak to would know much either. Ever since I moved here, I've understood that the asylum is something to stay far away from."
She paused for a minute before saying,
"Of course, there are still stories and ideas, but I'll tell you this for goodwill. Nothing good comes from that asylum. It's best you leave it alone."
Despite saying she knew nothing, something about this lady's warning felt real to me. I also noticed she mentioned she moved here, so I decided to ask, "So, before you leave, do you know if maybe there's anyone who grew up here and maybe knows something that could help us?" She looked annoyed but sluggishly replied,
"A lot of people grew up in this town, but the only one I can think of to help is Mary. Her family was involved somehow with the asylum, and she doesn't live that far."
After that, the lady kindly gave us directions to Mary's house, and in less than 10 minutes, we were standing at our front door. The house was extremely large and quiet, but it was obviously old, and I could tell just by looking at it that there hadn't been any repairs in years. We knocked, and in about 2 minutes, an elderly lady opened the door slightly.
"Can I help you?"
she said, standing behind the door. "Yes, we're looking for Mary. We wanted to ask a few questions about the abandoned asylum," I replied. The woman remained silent for a while before reluctantly inviting us into the home. The house's interior was just as run down as its exterior, with the paint peeling off and its floors confirming to me that the house was extremely old. Mary showed us a couch and informed us to wait for her here as she went to get what she needed. She returned a few minutes later with a file completely covered in dust and told us everything there was to know about the abandoned asylum was in there. After a while of talking, we discovered Mary's grandfather was head of operations at the asylum while it was running, and he passed away shortly after it was closed. She explained the file was put together by an employee at the asylum during an investigation that eventually resulted in the closing of the asylum. The case was handled quietly, and the family obtained the file after the asylum was closed, keeping it to avoid any scandals or leaks. However, when the kids went missing, the police asked Mary's father for information, and again, the file was used quietly, and the government found its contents too problematic and swept the case under the rug. Mary appeared emotional talking about this. She proceeded to tell us she'd uncovered the contents of the file after her father's passing and had been burdened by the guilt of keeping it all hidden.
"I wasn't going to help you at first, but you seem like good people. I think you will do the right thing with that file and bring light to the activities of what went down at that asylum."
Mary seemed to have confused us for a journalist or some sort, so I responded with, Mary, there seems to be a bit of confusion here. While we do find everything you've told us intriguing, we didn't come here to get the scoop on this. We're here because people believe the building's haunted, and there are various myths revolving around the asylum. We'd hoped you'd know a little bit about its history. Thankfully you did, but we still need to visit the asylum and find out what's really going on. Maybe there's even some truth behind the myths. Mary's expression had completely changed now, and she looked almost pale as she said,
Whatever you do not visit that place. Just take the file and release the truth.
She paused before grabbing Jessica's arm and saying,
That asylum is no place for people like you. The devil lives there now. The devil and all his demons.
Jessica quickly pulled back her arm and got up before saying, Jacob, we should go. I think we have enough. Mary began to frantically look around, saying,
Don't go. Don't go.
I got up and thanked Mary before leaving with Jessica and heading to the asylum. Little did I know, that would be the biggest mistake we ever made. I think it was about an hour later, and my entire group was standing at the gates of the asylum. We had met up earlier to discuss what we had all discovered. The group that visited the library didn't find much, but they'd managed to find the blueprints of the asylum. We told them about our discussion with Mary and proceeded to look at the contents of the file together. The file contained all sorts of horrible tests and experiments that were done on the mental patients in the asylum. These experiments only led the patients to slowly lose more of themselves until they were eventually void. As time passed, patients began to die, and the asylum decided to bury the corpses on its grounds. What really began to worry the doctor, however, was the living patients who had already been losing themselves suddenly began to have regular conversations with their dead colleagues. They would be heard laughing hysterically and calling the names of the dead in the middle of the night. It didn't take long before the patients who hadn't been involved in the experiments began acting the same way, and eventually, the doctors. It was as if all those in the asylum began slowly losing themselves until they were completely void and could no longer function mentally. As we looked at the old asylum from outside its gates, it became increasingly obvious nothing good would come from walking through its doors. The asylum was a 3-story building, and it covered around 50 hectares of land. The building seemed way older than Mary's home, however, and its exterior had already begun deteriorating, adding to its already eerie look. I continued looking at the building when I suddenly saw a man staring at us from a window upstairs. That's when I said, "Hey, who the hell is that?" pointing towards the window. Everyone immediately turned their attention to where I was pointing, but shockingly, there was absolutely no one there. "Ha ha, very funny," Mason said, assuming I was playing a prank on them. I was stunned and concerned because I could have sworn I had seen someone at the window. Everyone played it off as a joke and began walking into the asylum. I followed behind and tried to focus on the task at hand, but all I could really think about was Mary's warning. I stepped into the asylum. I immediately felt the temperature go down drastically. The building was extremely cold, and although I could tell by looking at it that no one had been there in years, it didn't in any sense feel that way. It actually felt like I had walked onto a stage and had 1,000 eyes watching. We continued walking deeper into the asylum, looking for anything that would explain the paranormal stories that surrounded the building. The floors were still stained with blood, and the rooms were filled with chairs and beds with straps for the patients. The group had stayed together exploring the building when suddenly I followed them into a room, and I was alone. At that point, I'd assumed they were playing a prank on me. "Guys, very funny. You've had your laugh, now let's move on and get out of here," I said, expecting a response. Instead, I was met with a deathly silence, and the temperature got even colder. I was completely scared and alone in the room when someone walked past. I immediately walked out to follow the person, but once again, there was no one there. At this point, I decided it was better to leave the asylum and wait outside for the others. I turned to leave, but I was met with the sight of a young woman in a gown and rotting flesh standing in front of me. My heart dropped at the sight of her, and she was so close to me that I could feel her extremely cold breath on my face. The lady only had one eye intact, while the other was being eaten by maggots and releasing a rancid smell. She slowly got closer and began to open her mouth. I closed my eyes and prepared for whatever was about to happen when I suddenly heard a scream from upstairs. I opened my eyes to see she was gone, and I immediately ran upstairs to see what had happened. I looked around upstairs for about 10 minutes before eventually finding Jessica sitting alone on the floor with her head in her hands. She appeared to be mumbling some words I couldn't understand, so I slowly approached her and said, "Hey Jess, are you okay? I don't know what's happening, but we need to leave right now. Come on." Jessica slowly raised her head and turned to me. She responded with, "But Jacob, we can't leave. We have to wait for the others so we can all go together. Jessica had messed up her hair in a way that had her face covered, and the room was so dark I could barely make out anything. But a part of me agreed with her, so I sat beside her and we waited. We had waited for almost 30 minutes in the dark and cold silence, so I figured it would have been a better idea to go look for the others instead. "Hey, do you remember where you lost the others? Maybe we can go find them and leave," I asked. However, I didn't get a response from Jessica. All I got was complete silence. I assumed she was probably just stressed out and didn't hear me, so I said, "Jess, we need to leave soon." This time, Jessica replied, once again lifting her head slowly to face me as she said,
"Don't you get it, though? We can't leave. You have to stay with us now. All of us. Together."
As she faced me, her hair was out of her face, and my heart dropped as I came to the horrific realization that I hadn't found or been with Jessica at all. The woman began to slowly chuckle before bursting out into full laughter. Her laugh felt like needles piercing through my ear, and before I could react, the room was full of other patients, also partially decomposed. They all joined in with her laughter and began walking towards me. Their stench filled the room, and no matter where I looked, their faces would appear, some more filled with maggots than others. At this point, I was completely lost and could barely hear my own thoughts. My body soon began to join in on their laughter. I tried vigorously to fight and gather my thoughts, but all my body could do was laugh and laugh and laugh until I realized I had lost myself. "Sir, are you all right?" I opened my eyes slowly in response to the voice I had just heard. A part of me wondered if I was still in the asylum hallucinating, but as I regained consciousness, I looked around to see a bunch of paramedics attending to my group and me. The police were also on the scene questioning Mary, who had placed a call to inform them we were in danger after we visited her home. I stayed conscious for about 2 minutes more before blacking out and waking up 2 days later in Eastern State Hospital, Virginia. Somehow, I had regained total consciousness and was aware of my surroundings. The rest of them, however, weren't so lucky. They all appeared to be conscious, but weren't in any way responsive to what happened around them. The police informed me Mary had called them, and by the time they arrived, I was found laughing hysterically right behind the asylum's front door. This would mean I hadn't taken up to 11 steps in the asylum, and everything I'd experienced was all a part of the trance. The rest of my group, however, were found a long time later and had remained unresponsive. It's been 9 years since my experience with the asylum. Jessica and the rest of my group were placed in a different asylum. I have since given up on exploring all things paranormal, and I visit them regularly to remind myself what I experienced was real and not just a bad dream. Therapy has been helping, but I still see the patients in my nightmares. And every day, I wish I had just listened to Mary's warning. I hope my experience has convinced you all that behind every myth, there is some truth. And it is only those who are suicidal that would doubt the existence of the paranormal.